Hello girls and welcome to the Boudoir Français channel. Today, it's a complete and free tutorial where I'll show you how to make this gorgeous quilted velvet vanity. I just finished it and I'm really so happy. I think it's super cute. I'll share a few little videos so you can see the details of this beautiful vanity. To sew the vanity, you obviously need a main fabric. So try to take something quite thick. So try to take a fabric that is not too thin, because we still need a fabric that holds up so that the vanity does not collapse on itself and is not too fragile. So I used corduroy, and of course you'll need batting to quilt your fabric. So mine there, you can see it's already cut, quilted. It's already been used, but basically the batting is this. It's the padded part that you can easily find at a fabric store to give that quilted effect and have a material that holds its shape well. You'll need a lining, so I used, well, there's not much left, but I basically used a beautiful gingham fabric that creates a stunning contrast with the red of the vanity. I'm such a fan. You'll also need a zipper, so make sure to get one that's 60 cm long. 60 cm is more than enough. Personally, I prefer to use plastic zippers for this kind of thing, even though they're a bit less pretty than metal ones. In general, there are fewer issues. They break less quickly than metal ones. So there you go, I encourage you to go for a plastic zipper and you'll have a lot fewer issues with it. And you'll also need bias tape to finish the top and bottom of the vanity. So I couldn't find any bias tape that matched my gingham, so I made my own bias tape. It's not very complicated to make. You just need to cut a 5 cm strip on the bias and you'll have your bias tape that matches perfectly with the fabric. I also used a little satin ribbon to put on the zipper because, you know, it just looks nicer that way. It adds a really cute little detail. So without further ado, I'm going to open this little vanity. So here's the inside of the vanity, which is just gorgeous like this with the pink gingham and the pink fabric. So honestly, it's deep enough to fit quite a lot of things inside. Not just toiletries, you can put a lot of other things inside. It's just perfect for storing all our stuff that's lying around. So as you can very clearly see right inside there, the seams are indeed very carefully edged with bias binding, so it is quite easy to sew. Of course, I'll show you everything in the tutorial. I'm sharing the free tutorial to make the vanity from A to Z, and if you want a ready-to-use pattern, check the link in the description. There, you'll find the pattern for those who don't want to bother trying to make the pattern themselves. You can find the pattern on the Boudoir Français website. Okay, so here I have my velvet, my fabric. I used a velvet. And so here we have the batting. I found some batting that I recently discovered and purchased, which is already quilted with a variety of waterproof fabric. So I might not need to line my fabric. I'm going to show you. That way, the waterproof part will be on the other side, acting as the lining. But since you might not have the same kind of batting, I'm going to add another additional fabric material to line it, the lining of the vanity, so you can clearly see it better and understand the process more easily and effectively. So what I do is quilt my fabric before cutting my pieces, you know. The problem is that if you cut your pieces first and then quilt them, you may have problems. You won't have the exact dimensions of your pieces, so I really encourage you to always quilt your fabric first, then cut your pieces for the sake of precision. So before I quilt, I'm going to draw my lines with a ruler to make sure my quilting will be nice and even. I'm going to use a big ruler like this. I'm going to reuse the width as a guide for the distances between each of my lines. So I'm using a washable chalk. It's a chalk. It's a powder. When you tap on it a bit, the lines disappear. So here I'm quilting my fabric. There are still some little techniques to quilt without the layers creating those kinds of puckers. First of all, if you can slightly reduce the stitch tension here, more than usual. I put it on 4, but it will depend so much on your machines that I can't give an atypical measurement like that either. Loosen the knob. This reduces presser foot pressure, reducing shifting. Remove the pin and pull fabric outward. This will make the presser foot press less on the fabric and won't push it towards you as much, which will reduce the shifting of the layers. Here, I'm going to remove my pin and I'm going to pull outward like this to keep the fabric nice and taut. In fact, the secret is to keep your fabric nice and taut. There you go. You keep it taut. And also what I do is use a little scissor like this to push the fabric here towards the presser foot, because actually the presser foot does the opposite. The presser foot will gently push your top fabric towards you, and the feed dogs will instead securely capture and hold the fabric such as it is designed to do. That's why sometimes your fabrics like that shift. So what we're going to do is stretch your fabric, and using a little scissors like this, you're going to push the material under the presser foot like this. And we move forward like this little by little, keeping it taut with our hands and pushing. So we're going to cut the top of the vanity. The main part, so here, is right at the fold. So that means I'm going to place it, I'm going to set it up like this. And then I'm going to flip it over to get the second part. So make sure you have enough width. Same for the second little part. I'm going to place it at the fold, and then I'm going to turn it to get my whole piece. And finally, I will also need the top part as well. You'll also need to cut for the hips here, but you'll have to cut that on a part that you haven't quilted. So I'll remove a little bit of my quilting. Oh well, to be able to cut, so here you'll cut double to make the little handle that we'll find here on top, like this. There you go. Okay, so I've finished cutting the fabric pieces. So there's the top and bottom of the vanity, the big rectangle, the small rectangle, and the handle that I've already pre-folded in half so I can sew it. Obviously you will need a zipper, so I couldn't find the same red one, so that will do. Make sure, of course, that your zipper is long enough to go all the way around. And I've cut exactly the same pieces in the lining, so for the lining, here's a super important tip. Don't hesitate to remove 2 millimeters from each side, because the inside will definitely be smaller than the outside. You see, if I put this part here, which will be round, the circumference on the inside will definitely be smaller than the one on the outside. So don't hesitate to take off 4 millimeters from the circumference, because you'll see that the inside is smaller and you'll end up with excess material if you don't remove a little bit of fabric. Also, for the finishing touches, you'll need some bias tape. I bought some bias tape. They didn't have pink, they had black. So I think I'm going to make my own bias tape from the checkered fabric. Making bias tape is a bit of a pain, but I still prefer to have a nice bias that matches my fabric rather than an ugly black one. So I'm going to prepare my bias tape, and I'll see you right after. So here I've stitched the edge of my lining on the top and bottom to attach it to the fabric. I'll iron it to make sure it's nice and flat, but you shouldn't press too much if you're working with velvet, and you also shouldn't press down too hard to avoid crushing your padding. Now I've cut my handle. I made it double because I didn't have enough to make a fold here for a seam allowance. So I'm just going to fold it like this, and then I'll stitch it and turn it inside out, leaving a small opening. So I'll stitch all around, leave an opening here, then I'll close it with a little hand stitch. Okay, so I've sewn my lining and attached it to my main fabric on the logs, let's call them that, on the top and bottom. I'll iron it to make sure it's nice and flat. Never press your iron down on the velvet. So now you're going to polish it. There's one that will be underneath, so we can flatten it a bit more, it doesn't matter. This will be the bottom log. And so here we're going to iron my handle a little bit. Similarly, we want to avoid crushing the velvet. So I'm going to iron just on one side. That way, the side that hasn't been in contact with the iron will be the part I put on top. So we're going to use a lot of steam and not press down too hard afterward. You may not have taken velvet like me, so you don't have to take all these precautions. We're going to attach the handle. I'm positioning it in the center. We're doing this now before we do all the assembly, as it will be much simpler than doing it at the end. So I'm going to position it right in the center, of course. And so here you're going to make a little arc or semicircle. you're going to stitch all around, roughly up to here on both sides, to make sure your handle is well secured. Also, we're going to take the large rectangle of the vanity and you're going to notch it here. I'm showing you how to notch at the junction of the two 1 cm seam allowances. Ensure you notch precisely at this point. You're going to notch here at the junction of the two seam allowances. So here I've made a little mark with a washable pen so you can see exactly the edge. And so you're going to notch here and you do just the same thing on the other side. There you go. To make sure I notch in exactly the right place, I'm tracing my seam allowance very carefully at 1 cm from the edge. Here too, so I have the exact spot where I need to notch my seam. And there you go. And so we can indeed start positioning our zipper. So here I'm going to place the seam on the side and I'm going to baste it so it doesn't move anymore, so it's well secured. So here, my seam allowance right here, I'm going to fold it over and baste it so it doesn't move anymore. I'm taking a thread, there you go, make sure to respect your seam allowances. I'm going to fold it over nicely at a vertical angle, 1 cm, there you go. I'm basting so that it stays nicely folded and doesn't move anymore. I'm going to do the same on both sides. There you go. I can even make a little stitch on the inside like this so that it stays nicely pressed without going through the fabric, so it doesn't show on the outside. There you go. It's really just to secure my seam allowance well so it doesn't move anymore. And it won't fray too much either, and it's perfect like that. So I'm going to do the same on both sides. So once my seam here is nicely pressed, I can position my zipper on this first seam. So your zipper is facing you, you open it, and you place the little teeth like this towards the inside, and then you can start to sew, pinning all along the edge to begin right at the edge of your rectangle. For now, I'm just going to secure it well. There you go. Now that I've pinned my zipper, I'm going to baste it like this. That way, I'm sure that under the machine, my zipper is well secured and won't move. So here, actually, my zipper might look like it's a bit wavy. It's just that I've secured it in volume, meaning I've placed my vanity like this in volume. To have a zipper with teeth that is well positioned in relation to the rounded shape like this, you don't have to go into this level of detail, but I find that the zipper will position itself better and will be less constraining on my vanity when it's shaped. That's why I'm basting it well so it doesn't move anymore and keeps the shape I want. I can even, like this, shape it to baste. It will be easier. And so, with a thread, I'm going to secure my zipper well. So, when we sew on the machine, we won't sew too close to the zipper because since the fabric is quite thick, we're going to try to leave some distance between the little teeth of the zipper and the fabric. Otherwise, it will always catch your fabric when you pull on your zipper, and that will be a hassle. So, change the presser foot. If you have a single branch presser foot, it will be much more convenient so you won't be hindered. I really start at the point where I've notched, so at the corner, there you go. You start at this point, you make a back stitch, and you definitely don't go any further. And we move forward like this, making sure not to sew too close to the picots. So, as you can see, I've sewn the little handle here. I've pressed it on the sides, and now I've sewn my zipper and removed the basting thread. Before flipping the zipper and doing a top stitch to keep it well pressed, we're first going to sew part of the lining. You're going to notch sides just like we did for the fabric, the top part, so I'm going to notch while respecting my seam allowances. I do it without a guide, but if you need a guide, don't hesitate at all. So I'm going to place it right sides together. Don't forget, here you folded the edge. You just need to use the edge here as a reference to make sure it's positioned correctly. So we're going to place the lining well at the corner, making sure to respect the angle here. I'm just going to lift this up to make sure it's right. So it's right here where I started my first zipper stitch. So I'm placing it here. I'll start right here. And similarly, I'm going to position my lining at the level of my zipper. You can put the single branch presser foot back on. It will be easier. You can change the color of your thread if you want. You can use pink or white. There you go. First, we're going to make a first stitch, 5 millimeters from the edge. And there you go. I'm going to sew my lining at the zipper 5 millimeters from the edge. So we are indeed right sides together.
So you've made your first stitch on the lining. You're going to be able to easily press the seam of the lining flat on the side for the first time. You've pressed it to the side. We're going to baste the lining actually so that it stays well pressed like this on the side. You'll understand why later. So I just take a thread and a needle and I'm going to baste my fabric, securing it so that it stays well pressed on the side. So that means you need to capture the fabric, you need to capture your thicknesses, you need to capture everything so that it stays well pressed. There you go, I'm making big stitches. So once this is done and my fabric is well pressed and lying flat on the side, I can just pull it out like this, fold it in half to bring my zipper out nicely. And like this, under the machine, I'm going to really try to pull my zipper out as much as possible. So I'm going to make a stitch here 5 millimeters from the edge to really press my zipper and all my layers together so that they lie flat. Of course, I stop at the beginning and at the end of my zipper. So we're going to be under the machine. And there you go. Now I'm going to stitch at 0.5 millimeter to really press all my layers down. And I'm going to pull on my zipper to bring it out as much as possible. There you go. So we have this first stitch done, which really presses all the seams together. I can now remove my basting thread. There you go. So I've closed my zipper and now I can assemble the second part, which is the little rectangle. So what I'm going to do before positioning my zipper is to make some marks, just to make sure I position my zipper correctly at the right spot. So here, for example, I'm going to make a mark right across from my padding. That way I'm sure to position it correctly later without any misalignment. I'll make another mark here. For example, I'll do another one there. So before stitching this part here, I'm going to make a small stitch on the machine to secure these two parts. So be careful when you go over the rails of your zipper, be careful. But now it's time to secure this part. So we're going to make a stitch right here at 5 millimeters. That will work very well from the edge to secure my layers. What I'm going to do is pre-fold the lining as well. That way it will also be captured. I'm placing it right in front. There you go. You can baste if you're not feeling comfortable. I do it a bit quickly. So when you have excess thickness like this and your presser foot is struggling to move the fabric forward, don't hesitate to grab the thread back here to pull it. And you take a pair of scissors like this and you push to help the fabric move forward. So here I'm going to be very careful not to break my needle. I'm just going to simply go in with the hand wheel. And here we're really going to make a good back stitch. And you're going to do the same thing, of course, on both sides. So if I turn it around, the finish is done. So here, obviously, there are some little red threads sticking out because I'm made in two colors, so to speak. On the inside, it's also secured. And here too, it's clean. You can do the same thing on the other side. We've made our markings so we will need to assemble this second part. So you're going to place it like this, right sides together. We're going to move to the other side to better see our markings. So you're just going to pin it, obviously respecting the markings you've made. There you go. So I'm not going to baste because I'm a bit lazy. But if you can baste, of course, like last time, or put in a lot of pins to secure all your layers well. So this time we're going to stitch all the way down. We're not going to stop at the zipper. We're really going to capture all the layers. There we go. We're going to stitch. Here we'll stop to avoid catching the lining. Then we'll go back, stitch there, and all the way down. Don't stitch too close to the rails of your zipper. So I start by lifting my lining. So I cut off the excess zipper. It was useless. I'm making a small back stitch. Now I'll fold back my lining and continue here. Let's go, moving forward like this. I'm going to secure materials with scissors, press firmly. So now, at this point, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to carefully lift my lining and I'm going to gently come back right here and continue my stitching. There you go. So I made this second stitch right here all the way down. Now what I need to do is stitch the lining of the small rectangle. It's going to be a bit of the same principle as here, but simpler because we won't need to notch. In the end, it's going to look like this, right? The strip is going to be like this, so you position it now right sides together. And before making that stitch, we're going to sew here on the sides first. So you'll see, it's not very complicated. It's just a bunch of little steps, but it's not very complicated. So I'm pinning here. I'm pinning on the other side too. So you won't be able to go too far because after that the fabric isn't free. So you're going to, there you go, you can stitch about 4 centimeters, that's great. So I'm going to stitch here. So I'll pinch it under so it doesn't get in my way. There you go, we quickly find ourselves stuck by the thickness, so there's no point in trying to go further. There you go, so I stitched here and now I can make my stitch here. By the way, there are a lot of people who tell me they're afraid to get into lingerie. If some of you are able to sew this vanity, you are 1,000 times capable of getting into lingerie, so don't worry. So I'll be able to sew my layers here, my lining to my zipper. I'll be able to secure it well, position it properly, and then hold my thickness to my zipper with a pin. So I'm going to pin all the way along. So you stitch all the way to the end and you can stop at the mark where you stopped. There you go. So I assembled it here 5 millimeters from the edge. So you're going to come here and actually lay the seam to the side and carefully baste it all along here on these thicknesses so that it stays nice and flat. Only then will we remove this layer completely before folding over our second layer in order to do a final top stitch exactly like this one. There you go. I've basted securely now my lining right onto its side, so now I can really bring out all of my layers properly laid aside. And here I'm going to press my seam. Here too I'm going to lay it to the side. I'm going to do a top stitch at 5 minim, but I'm going to be very careful not to catch my lining. Really, it should stay nice and flouncy. And then I'll be able to capture all my layers together. First, I'm doing a top stitch, making sure to press my lining down well so I don't catch it. I stop, I put my lining back like this, and I'm coming to finish. Stitch all the layers together. I stop for a moment. So now I'm properly repositioning my lining and moving forward. So make sure to stretch all your layers well. That's to avoid any puckering, to really spread your fabric. Here, I'm spreading it out well, really pushing my fabric. I'm also pushing the lining to avoid any puckering. Once everything is properly aligned, I move forward. There you go, right over there. Please don't forget to make sure to stop here. Thank you. I'm just taking off my lining and I'm getting back to it, you know? And you'll be able to easily remove your basting thread. There you go, it's coming along. I'll show you what it looks like. So here the inside is lined. We have the outside. If I gently pull on my zipper, it smoothly opens up, revealing the inner lining. So now what we're going to do is carefully pin the fabric here at the bottom edge and also at the top section, ensuring it is secure. And then, in the same manner, still here, you will stop. You are not going to go any further, and you will understand in a moment why. From the beginning, I have been telling you to leave the lining free, free as a bird. With my hand like this, I'm going to slide my fabric and pin it to secure it well at the bottom and at the top. So I've pinned my layers and I've just made a stitch to hold the two layers together so they won't move anymore. So the lining and the outer fabric are nicely pressed. I just stopped here to leave the lining vacant. I'm just going to try to trim a little bit in case there's any lining sticking out so that it looks nice and clean. So there you go. Now that I've pressed all my layers together, I can start sewing the side seams. So you're going to sew these two seams together and do the same for the lining. So I turn it inside out and you place it right sides together. And you'll be able to sew 1 centimeter from the edge. There you go, it's starting to take shape. So, as you can see, I've closed the lining here with a small hand stitch. So we're going to be able to assemble the top and the bottom. First, we're going to pin all around. There you go, girls, we're almost done with the vanity. So here, I'm showing you that I've pinned all around and I can sew at 5 millimeters from the edge. I'm not going to sew at 1 centimeter first because it will be difficult to place the bias tape with all the layers and everything. Because you see, the border here is at least 5 millimeters thick. So in fact, that plus that plus that, that's still quite a bit thick. So if I sew at 1 centimeter, I'm worried that, I don't know if I'm being clear, but it might be a bit too thick for the bias tape to cover the entire seam properly. Okay, so I've sewn all around at 5 millimeters from the edge, and now I can place my bias tape, which I made myself. I just cut a strip on the bias. I'm going to carefully pre-fold my bias like this, so the finish will be done with precision, and I'm going to gently pin it all around. You can also sew it by hand if needed, because sometimes the pins, especially in tricky spots under the machine where the fabric doesn't sit quite how we'd like, can end up poking us. So don't hesitate to baste your bias by hand. That way, you're sure not to hurt yourself, and you're also sure that your bias won't move. Pay attention to detail as you go. And there you go, I'm going to overlap my first layer that I had already pre-folded here. I'm going to overlap it. I'm just going to reuse the same pin, why not? So here, I can actually just basically simply cut the excess bias tape. There you go, I've finished pinning all around. So it wasn't very long. It's actually pretty nice to do in the end. So now I can go under the machine to sew all around my little sausage, little log, my bias tape. And there you go. After that, we'll do the same thing. You'll do the same thing. I'm not going to show you twice on the top. Here we go. We're moving forward little by little because we're going to have to pivot our log. I don't know what to call it, the vanity. We're going to have to pivot it so that it's always nice and flat under the machine. And there you go, I finished sewing the bias tape, and honestly it gives a nice finish. So you'll be able to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to turn my vanity around to see how it looks, and as you can see inside it has a clean, neat finish, and it's not too complicated to do. And there you go, the tutorial is finished. I hope you enjoyed it and that it wasn't too hard for you. Personally, I loved sewing this beautiful vanity. If you're planning to sew it, definitely don't hesitate to tag Boudoir Français on Instagram. That way I can share your creations, and I love seeing my students' creations. It always makes me happy. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's super important. If you want sewing tips every week, and if you don't know me, I worked for the Chanel house for 6 years before creating my own lingerie brand called Atelier 1904. And for the past 3 years now, I've created Boudoir Français to share my expertise with as many people as possible so that you can learn professional sewing techniques and avoid making the same beginner mistakes in sewing. So if you want to find all the courses I offer, head over to the link in the description on the Boudoir Français website, where you have a range of sewing classes for beginners and more advanced sewists. Well, I wish you a very good day, and I'll see you in the next video on the Boudoir Français channel.